Alright everyone, in this video I want to give you 5 reasons why every young man and woman on a self-improvement journey should quit smoking weed. Now just so you don't think that I'm some stiff who can't empathize with why you might like smoking weed and that I'm just up here preaching from the soapbox, you are sorely mistaken. I started smoking weed in 2004 when I was a freshman in high school. I mean, me and my boys back then, we were like the stoner crew, and we would drive around and smoke Fat L's, and I basically have been smoking weed ever since. I smoked weed in college and on and off since 2004, which is coming up on almost 20 years now. I get it. So hear me out on this. The first reason why every young man on a self-improvement journey should quit smoking weed is weed destroys your social skills when you are high. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never met anyone who is better socially when they're high. Social engagement when you're stoned tends to be very cerebral. It tends to be very above the neck, acidic, right? Get, fucking digits and shit, right? We tend to have ideas when we're high. We tend to string thoughts together when we're high. But the vibe that a young man on self-improvement wants to hit, you know, the vibe that's good for business and attraction and working the room, that vibe is less cerebral and it's more energetic. It's more of a feeling. Think about how in attraction, sometimes no words even need to be spoken. You can just make an eye connection and there's an energy beam that's created between your eyes and the eyes of the person you're engaging with. No words need to be said and you both just feel it. Okay, and that is more of the vibe that we're going for in business and attraction and self-development. I mean, consider the fact that when you're stoned, how hard is it to even make eye contact? I know that when I'm high and I try to make eye contact with someone, my eyes are fucking geeking out and stuff because there's just something weird about it, right? It's just the stoned wavelength is different than the wavelength for drawing people in with that energetic connection. So it's a major red flag that when you're high, you can't even hardly make eye contact. All right, reason number 2 why young men on self-development should quit smoking weed. That is, weed doesn't only kill your social skills when you're high, it also kills your social skills in the following days when you're sober. And why is that? It's because all of socialization, whether it's attraction or business or working a room, it's all a vibe, okay? And whatever we're feeling in any given moment when we're engaging with someone, they're gonna feel what we're feeling. The way you feel in your mind and in your body is going to bleed out into your social interactions. So if you're feeling positive, funny, energetic, charismatic, self-entertaining, if you're in a good place, if you feel good in your own skin, when you're talking to someone, when you're chatting someone up, guess what? They're going to feel it too. Conversely, if you're feeling like shit, if you're feeling all hungover and strung out, like you can't experience any pleasure in your own body, guess what? That's going to come out of you as like a kind of a dark, muddy, heavy energy that's totally destructive when it comes to socializing, bringing people in, attracting other people. Now, what's this have to do with weed? Well, weed is an addictive drug, okay? And I know there's been some debate about this in the science, but anyone who's ever smoked weed before knows that if you start smoking weed on a regular basis and you go a couple days or a couple weeks or a couple years smoking weed, guess what? If you want to feel good, you're going to have to smoke weed that day. You do become dependent on weed to hit that dopamine hotspot in your body and in your mind. It's hard for sober activities to compete with the amount of happy chemicals that are released when you suck in that rip and that dope floods your system. So naturally, the more you smoke, the more it becomes the case that in order for you to feel good in your body, in order for you to feel happy, and therefore for you to put out that vibe of happiness to bring people into you, you're going to need to smoke weed. But of course, when you're high, we know that you aren't putting out that good social vibe. It's a different kind of happiness that you feel when you're high, and it's not the kind that can bring in people toward you via attraction energy. As neuroscientist, YouTuber Andrew Huberman says, addiction is the progressive narrowing of the things that bring us pleasure. Think about that for a second. It's a progressive narrowing of the things that bring us pleasure. So when we become addicted to weed, it starts to be the case that only weed can bring us pleasure. And therefore, we aren't feeling good when we're sober. And when we're not feeling good when we're sober, we're not making others feel good when they're around us because our energy is so murky. So if you're going about your day just thinking about getting home later that night so you can rip that bowl and feel that rush of happy chemicals again, you're not going to be putting out that infectiously positive vibe that's so essential to attracting people to you. I mean, think about the way you feel after a nice solid workout and how bubbly you're feeling and how easy it is for you to go out and meet someone and say, hey, how you doing, right? You approach people effortlessly when you've got that flood of happy chemicals from, say, working out. Compare that to how you feel as you stumble out of your place in the morning after a long night of smoking blunts, and you can't even function until you have some huge amount of caffeine or something. And then, do you ever approach women in that state of mind? Of course not. All right, reason number 3 why any young man on self-improvement should quit smoking weed. Weed destroys your sleep. We as jaw hackers are literally, in some cases, cutting our jawbones and moving them to increase the size of our airways so that we can breathe better and sleep better. And then we're going to go out and smoke weed because we don't know how to handle our sobriety, and we're going to destroy all that effort we're putting in. Weed fucks with sleep in a variety of ways. It prevents you from achieving certain levels of depth in your sleep, and it fucks with sleep cycles in other ways that I'm not super scientifically proficient in my understanding of. You don't even need to understand how weed is affecting your sleep in those deep layers when you're unconscious. Think about how, for so many people, myself included, when I go to bed and I'm stoned, I fucking toss and turn for like at least an hour, sometimes much longer, as my thoughts are racing at a mile a minute from the cannabis. Now, granted, for a lot of us, that's the reason we smoke. We smoke so that our thoughts race like that. Okay, we love that kind of a mile a minute, light bulbs popping off in your brain experience. But let's be real, it's not good for sleep. And so you'll go to bed at your normal bedtime, which for me might be, between 9:30 and 10:30, and you won't be able to fall asleep until midnight. Those 2 hours that you're losing from, say, 9 to 11 or from 10 to 12, those 2 hours of sleep, science has recently shown, are disproportionately more important than, let's say, if you make up for those 2 hours the next morning by sleeping in. You get a lot of bang for your buck for those first 2 hours of sleep, and you're just going to throw that all away? As sober people, and we'll get to this later in the video, as sober people, we need to really savor our sober pleasures, and sleep is one of those sober pleasures. Shakespeare wrote about the pleasures of slumber, right? In the old days, before everyone had poor jaw development and sleep apnea, sleep was seen as one of the great pleasures of life. Okay, and weed is just totally compromising that. And you know what else is awesome? Waking up feeling like $1,000,000, not waking up feeling like you've got a fucking rain cloud in your brain and regretting the fact that you got stoned the night before because you didn't have the discipline not to. There's no better feeling than getting up out of bed and remembering that, thank God I didn't smoke last night. How good do I feel right now? All right, reasons 4 and 5 for why young men on self-development shouldn't smoke weed are pretty heavy and hard-hitting, and we're going to go deep on this, okay? I'm warning you, we're going to go deep. But reason number 4 is weed prevents you from finding your true calling in life. So many young people are aimless. So many young people, and I've been through this myself, okay? I've been there. Don't know what to do with themselves. It's not that we're lazy. It's not that we don't want to work. It's that we don't know what the fuck to do. If we could just have a purpose that we could plug ourselves into on a daily basis en route to achieving that goal, we could be so much more productive. For example, with me, I did really well when I'm in school. When I have structure, when I know that my one job is to ace these classes, to get this GPA, I function well because I know what to latch my energies and my abilities into on a daily basis. But when we're stripped outside of the confines of a program like being a student, that's when we get really fucked as young men in this world. I don't think that young men's issue is so much not their willingness to work, it's that they don't know what to do. And this is where smoking weed really kills us, because weed prevents us from figuring out a vision for our life, a plan for our life, and prevents us from ever getting any traction in working toward that on a daily basis. And isn't this why so many of us smoke weed in the first place? Because we feel like the weed gives us that excitement, it gives us that vision for what we could do. And we like to smoke just so we can sit in those thoughts of what's possible for our lives, right? The irony, of course, is that the weed is a big part of what's clouding us and preventing us from ever latching onto a vision and taking action on it. In fact, I would say that's the number one reason that I've smoked weed throughout my life, is because of the vision questing element of it. It's like every time you smoke, you feel like you're, planning out your whole life with all of these amazing ideas, and you get so excited about doing this and that, but then you never act on it. Why? What's going on with that? Well, it's because you're making these plans for your life in an environment of artificial, unearned dopamine. You're smoking weed and you're flooding your brain with all these happy chemicals, and in that pool of those happy chemicals, all of this shit sounds cool and exciting. But of course, when you're stoned, you never actually do anything about it. You're just planning, and then at the end of your journal session or whatever, you say, okay, and tomorrow I'm going to wake up and I'm going to take this step toward achieving these goals. You go to bed, you wake up, and what happens? You're hungover. You feel like shit. You're cloudy. You didn't sleep well. And now all of a sudden, you're questioning, fuck, those ideas that I had last night, was it all a delusion? Was it all fake? Was it bullshit? And maybe it was, and maybe it wasn't. But one thing's for sure, right now, in this weed hangover, you are not ready to take any action on it. And this is the cycle that so many people get into. They smoke, they flood themselves with these happy chemicals, they come up with all these plans, they don't actually do anything about it that night, because that's for tomorrow when you're not so stoned, right? But then you wake up, you feel like shit, and the plan dies right then and there, and all you want to do is feel that same excitement that you felt last night when you were stoned. And of course, the only way to feel that is what? To smoke more weed. Because nothing can compete with the artificial flood of dopamine that you get from drugs like cannabis. The way a young person finds his calling is not by flooding your brain with unearned dope. The way you find your calling is to establish a baseline of sobriety. And then from that place of, okay, I'm sober and I'm stable, and this is kind of where I settle at, when I let all the mud in the water settle, here's where I land, and you ask yourself, what do I like to do from here? What, from this perspective of sobriety, do I enjoy doing? What gives me dopamine and allows me to have a sustainably enjoyable day as a sober person? A real man knows deep down that sobriety is part of the key of being a man. It's difficult, but deep down we all know that as men we have to learn to be sober sustainably. And so figuring out your vocation, figuring out your calling is kind of like solving a riddle or a mystery. And to solve that mystery, you need clues, you need evidence. And the evidence that you need specifically is, from a baseline of sobriety, you have to start figuring out, what the f*** do I like to do with my time? What's enjoyable for me? So we get sober and we stay sober for a while, and for a while it's fucking painful, man. It's painful because we're just like scratching and chomping at the bit for that cheap dopamine again. Especially when we've started smoking at a young age, we find it very difficult to have other sources of dopamine that can even compete with that, right? But you have to. You have to seek sober activities that can scratch that same itch, and they are out there. And when you start figuring that out, now we're getting somewhere. Now we're making progress in terms of finding a lifestyle that we can do every day to feed that itch we have for dopamine. Now, when I first started experimenting with this question of, okay, what do I find enjoyable when I'm sober? one of the things that I landed on was working with my hands. There's something about building and fixing things using tools out in the elements or in a shop that scratches that itch for a man. In this day and age, it's so rare for men to actually do anything with their hands. We go to school and we study from books and we work on computers, we become keyboard warriors. We don't actually get out into nature and do shit, right? We don't manipulate physical materials in the world, but there's probably something about that that is inherently satisfying to a man. Think of Matt Crawford's book, Shopclass is Soulcraft. He put together a whole philosophical treatise about why it's so inherently satisfying to build and fix things. Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is sort of along the same lines. In my own journey of figuring out how to have a sustainably sober life, I worked as an electrician, as a stonemason, as a carpenter. I converted 2 Sprinter vans, and I worked for a year and a half as a BMW mechanic at a BMW dealership in Boston. And I can tell you, I didn't even think about doing drugs in those days or smoking weed. I had no desire, because that feeling I would get from getting wired all day by engaging with cars or running wires or, wrestling with brake calipers, rotors on a vehicle, doing shit like that checks the boxes for what I'm describing in terms of sober yet sustainably dopamine-rich activities. And right now I work as a tax preparer. I took over my dad's tax prep business, and so I see for about 400 people what they do for a living and how much they earn in that work. And I can tell you that I have a ton of clients, probably like a dozen actually, who are tradespeople, especially union tradespeople, electricians, iron workers, pipe fitters, who are earning between $100,000 and $200,000 a year doing manual work. And this idea that manual work is somehow peasant, that it doesn't actually involve your brain, is totally wrong. Work like that does involve, yes, your hands, but it also involves your mind, and there's an intricate mind-body connection, sort of like with jiu-jitsu or exercise, where you can't just say that this is blue-collar buffoon work. No, this is mind-body work, and it pays damn well, and most importantly, it's fucking fun. Okay, point number 5 about why young men on self-improvement should quit smoking weed is that after you find your calling, point number 4, after you find your calling, weed prevents you from enjoying the daily grind that's required to actually live out your calling. As Andrew Huberman says, happiness is the progressive widening of the things and activities that give us pleasure. I think that a big part of becoming a man is realizing that what a man really does on a daily basis for his entire life is engage in an arduous activity, his work, that is productive and arduous, but that leverages the natural dopamine reward system that we have built into us as human beings to, although it's arduous, there's also a ton of pleasure there. Okay, so this is what people talk about when they talk about the grind. And if the grind was purely a grind, guess what? No one would fucking do it. But because the grind has this flip side to it of glory, right? And glory is not this abstract thing that I'm talking about. I'm talking about we have this innate dopamine reward system given to us by our Creator, who wants us to work, by the way. God wants us to work. Ora et labora, prayer and labor. This is the way of the monk. And so how has God endowed us with the ability to work sustainably as men? Yeah, work sucks and requires ardor, but God rewards us with this infinite source of dopamine that we can tap into. What is the dopamine reward system? For this, I will refer you to the work of Andrew Huberman. Huberman is big on this idea that dopamine is not just a reward chemical. Dopamine is also integral to the motivation system. Dopamine is the chemical that we achieve as a result of experiencing pain. This is a key idea. Building your life's work depends on establishing a sustainable dopamine reward schedule into your life. You have to be able to harvest the happy chemicals that you get from making progress on your goals on a daily basis, putting in that work. The following is a key idea, and I want you to pay very close attention to what I'm about to say. Dopamine is released in response to pain. Yes, you heard me correctly. In order to have dopamine, you must first have pain. Everyone is all abuzz these days about how dopamine is increased 250% for 2 hours after doing a 3-minute cold plunge. Well, why is that? Well, people think it's because cold water produces dopamine. That's false. It's the pain that the cold plunge induces that results in the production of dopamine. In order to have dopamine, you must first experience pain. So doing work on a paper, doing work on a problem set, framing a house, meeting with a client, and getting through a difficult social interaction, that's pain. But God has given us a system that rewards us when we endure through these healthy sources of pain. And that reward is dopamine, which is a source of pleasure, but more importantly, motivates us to keep pursuing that source of pain so that we can continue to have more reward chemical after the fact. Now, where does weed come into all this? Weed completely hijacks our dopamine reward system. Weed floods us with cheap dopamine. When we get accustomed to such high levels of unearned dopamine, the little bursts of dope that we get from struggling through difficult tasks that are required for us to live out our purpose, the work that we have to do on our daily grind, it becomes inherently uncomparable and unsatisfying as compared to ripping that fucking L. The more we can get away from the weed, the more we can savor the little bursts of happiness that we're meant to experience as men during the daily grind that we live out in pursuit of our purpose. All right, so that's it for this video. 5 reasons why all young men and women should quit smoking weed on their self-improvement journey. Let me know what y'all think in the comments below. Let me know what your experience is with weed and the reasons you've quit if you have. That's it for now. I'll talk to y'all soon. Peace out.